Hey, this is the real underscore G Warner on Instagram, Patreon, Twitter, and on YouTube. This is the first episode coming to the Betting the Pitch podcast network with Angel. You can find her at Roscoe Poop Scooper on Twitter, um, which is amazing, but actually is relevant to what we're going to talk about today, which is F1, start of the new 2025 season. And I guess let's start with Angel. You're an F1 enthusiast. The Australia Grand Prix is, I guess, tonight, late night, Saturday night in the United States. Um, Tell us a little bit, I guess, about yourself. You don't have to be too revealing, but you're a big F1 fan enough to make your Twitter handle about a famous driver.
Yeah, so maybe start with my Twitter handle,
Sure.
because that definitely tells something about me. It's Roscoe Poop Scooper because if you are a F1 fan, you would know Lewis Hamilton.
Okay.
And if you are a F1 expert, you probably know Lewis Hamilton has a dog named Roscoe. So when I was trying to come up with a Twitter name account associated with F1, I figured it has to be something associated with Hamilton. So there I am. I'm the biggest fan of Roscoe, and I'm happy to be his poop scooper.
Got it.
Um,
Well, I'm glad that makes one of
yeah.
us happy to do yard work for someone else's animal. But I'm really excited to get on this. We haven't done anything F1 or really any sort of racing related. It's usually just me trying to race the clock on the Betting the Pitch podcast network. But you can find our podcast here on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. Of course, you can subscribe to the channel at the real underscore G Warner on YouTube. And I'm trying to figure out exactly how to make this a reel slash a YouTube short format with potentially some picks coming end of show. But my plan today was try to get through a very, very log jammed first episode. But we have some interest in talking about the Drivers' Championship, the Constructors' Championship, and also this Australian Grand Prix. And make sure you follow Roscoe's Poop Scooper on Twitter, which I will certainly have attached in all descriptions for this podcast and make sure that you are spelling it right because who knows what that will look like on the search history. So I guess we could start maybe, Angel, if you'd give me an idea of what has happened from last season to this season that has, I guess, been newsworthy to you, maybe Lewis Hamilton related, or because I'm looking at Lando Norris, who seems to be a pretty clear
Hmm.
favorite to win the Drivers'
Yeah.
Championship.
Yeah, I would say last year in 2024, a lot definitely happened on the grades, right? I think the biggest bombshell news is probably Hamilton moving to Ferrari, which triggered a lot of driver movement in the market. Like you have him leaving Mercedes, going to Ferrari, leaving the Mercedes seat open, pushing Carlos Sainz out. And Carlo end up going to William, which I think is a really upcoming constructor this season and potentially next season when the regulation changes. And then you also have
Hold on,
a
hold on.
lot
Let
new
me stop you
rookie.
there. So regulation changes
Oh,
in terms of racing regulations, in terms of the vehicles that are being able to be driven. And forgive me if I don't know the parlance. I'm
no, yeah.
I'm learning F1 as we go, literally as I talk right now.
Yeah, of course. I think so the 2026 regulation change is gonna be on a lot of the cars. So how you design your car, like what is sort of the specs, requirements and everything. And a lot of time I think F1 they introduce a regulation change every few years and trying to introduce more of a level field for all the constructors, right? Because I think you can see like Mercedes was dominated from like 2010 to 2020, early 2020, and then you have when the regulation changed in 2022, Red Bull start becoming dominant, right?
Right.
And McLaren finally caught up last year, and another regulation is coming in 2026. So I think this year is gonna be interesting because I'm curious how many constructors are gonna invest a lot money in this year's race versus this year's car development versus their new regulation sort of car development in the upcoming seasons.
Got it. So I've done a little Drive for Fiving or Drive to Surviving, I think is the Netflix series.
Yep.
Netflix is not a sponsor of this podcast. Of course, I would love it because I am a shareholder, but that's besides the point. And I do know that there's, to me, a lot of parallels to a lot of the soccer podcasts that I do on this channel.
Mm-hmm.
That it seems like there's a lot of money invested in these things. It can go very, very poorly. As I think on the first few episodes, there are multiple bankruptcies already mentioned of team owners. I'm curious
Yep.
with. Of course, with these changes coming up and kind of what you just alluded to, is in other words, there are teams that are competing to win this thing. There are teams competing to try to maintain their position in the F1 because obviously it's the cream of the proverbial crop, if you will. But are you kind of suggesting, because I think there are a lot of parallels to European football, as they would call it, or soccer here in the United States, where
Mm-hmm.
in most leagues there are like a couple teams that are competing to win the whole thing. Is that
Yep.
the case? Because I see four drivers that are within 8 to 1 odds to win the drivers' championship: Lando Norris, Max Verstappen, Charles Leclerc, Lewis Hamilton, Oscar Piastri. Only those five are below 10 to 1, so getting a little bit more than 10% of a chance to win this whole thing, according to the casinos out there. So, do you think that that's a smaller number than you think actually have a chance to win it? Is Lando Norris, who's plus 175 in the Drivers' Championship winner odds, is that is it his season essentially, or is Max Verstappen, who had been previously dominating, a reasonable contender in your opinion?
Uh, okay. I think I'm gonna break down the question a little bit. I
Please
think
do. Please do.
from a from constructor's perspective, McLaren, Ferrari, and Red Bull, they're always favored. Well, I guess in the recent history, like recent years, right? I think Mercedes had put a lot of effort in the, like I mentioned, between 2010 to 2020, and now Red Bull, Ferrari, and McLaren finally caught up. And I would say from a constructor perspective, McLaren is definitely the most favored. You can see that from the testing that happened in Barcelona in February, and you can see that in the free practice from Thursday to yesterday, as well as a qualification, right? You have a McLaren locking up the front row, Lando Norris and the Oscar PSG.
Yeah,
Um,
to that end, sorry, McLaren, I do
yeah,
see as favorite to win the construction championship, which is the season long, I guess,
yeah.
since each team has two drivers that are in the competition, right? So McLaren currently even money, so that implied probability of 50%, which is a little bit inflated due to casinos trying to make a little money on each bet that comes in. But as you mentioned, Ferrari are plus 125, so clearly the second most likely to compete, then followed by Red Bull,
Yep.
Mercedes, and then a huge drop off to Aston Martin, Williams, Alpine, and others. So it seems like that aligns your, I guess, market view with what the market has out there, which, as a betting pitch podcast, we were generally looking for value. So, does Mercedes, I guess,
Mm.
let me ask you this. I know with your Lewis Hamilton ways and Roscoe Poop Scooper as a Twitter handle, which I can't believe I've said multiple times out loud on this podcast, but we're here. Mercedes seems like the closest of the, I guess the outsiders. Do you believe that Mercedes is investing this season, or are they more looking towards 2026 and the new rules?
I think they should be looking at 2026.
Okay.
They have a very young rookie, um, Kimi Antonelli.
Yep.
Sorry, I'm still familiarizing myself with
Kimmy
all the six
Antonelli is what
rookies.
it
It's
looks like to
so
me.
many.
Yes, yes.
Yes. With Kimi coming in, he's like 18 years old. He's raw ta He probably has the best raw talents you're gonna see in a few years, but still, it's a very young rookie, right? I think you're gonna always have a little bit learning curve coming into F1, being like from whether F2 or F3 um leagues. So I would say Mercedes, given the driver ability, it's less favored, like you mentioned, around like a very less than 10%, right?
Yep. Yep.
I think from that perspective, they definitely should focus on developing their driver talents this year and developing their cars next year so they have a better chance in the 2026 season.
Okay. So Red Bull previously dominant, now it looks like a little bit outside it looks to me like a two horse race, if you would, or two uh race car race almost. I don't know. That's probably not something to say, but McLaren and Ferrari. Okay. And it seems like just to go back to the individual drivers, because I know I started there initially and forgive
Yeah.
me for jumping around, but I'm used to a lot more structure when I do this podcast and I'm kind of learning as we go. But it seems like Lando Norris plus 175 to win the drivers' championship, followed by Max Verstappen, Charles Leclerc, Lewis Hamilton, who is a Mercedes, as you mentioned. But of those top two, I guess, let me ask you, because I remember from when I was vaguely or when I was watching the Drive to Survive, Max Verstappen in real life seemed to be winning every weekend, but that has changed. And clearly Lando Norris has come inside. I think I've seen him on Heineken commercials, so I think he's doing okay. How would you compare, I guess, the chances of a Lando Norris versus a Max Verstappen for the entire season? And then we'll get into Australia very soon after that.
Yeah, I think Lando definitely has in my opinion, has a better car. But you cannot ignore, you can never rule out Max Verstappen. The ability, his ability on the track is just unstoppable sometimes. So, I think, I do think, sorry, I know we're talking about Lando Norris and Max Verstappen.
This is
Um,
your show just as much as it's mine.
yeah,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I do think I'm a little bit surprised to see Oscar Piastri, how low of a chance he has.
Okay.
He has he has the best car on the track. And honestly, it's not his rookie year. He's been in the F1 league for this is his third season, I think. Um, and he won race last year, just probably not as many as Lando Norris, but um, he just signed a multi-year deal with McLaren, and that shows how much confidence the team has in him. And I do think I like his calm presence on the track a lot of times. Um, and I think I'm interested to see how the team manage the competition between Lando and Oscar in the same car. Because last year there's some drama on the track between these two, how the team favor each other based on some strategic calls, right? So I think I'm just I think Oscar is ranked a little bit lower than I thought
Okay.
based on the betting lines.
Okay, so at Roscoe Poop Scooper sees some value on Oscar Piastri at this point. And it seems like based on what I've been tracking from the Australia Grand Prix, that there's been a fair amount of belief in Oscar Piastri as well. His number has dropped from plus 675 to win the race in Australia on Saturday night, which I guess is tonight here in the United States, and is now all the way down 20 to it looks like down 10.5% to plus 325, which is pretty significant, a pretty big drop. I think is based on what you said, a great car and being a member or part of the greatest team that's favored to win the constructors championship at least at this point. McLaren pretty close to Ferrari, but looks like odds wise are certainly ahead. And you mentioned that there could be, because both Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri are both McLaren drivers. It seems like there's been some movement also backing Lando Norris on the Australian Grand Prix as well, but a lot more for Piastri. So, how do you see that team dynamic working in this race and also throughout the season?
Well, I would say um, Australia is Oscar Piastri's home race.
Okay.
So just a fan base and all the passion from the fans that probably gonna fuel up some confidence level to Oscar. By the way, I follow his mom's Twitter account as well, who's actually super funny. Um,
Does he have a dog?
but
Is it also named
no.
No. Okay.
No, they don't actually. Well, I think his mom might have a dog. She loves Platy, which I do too. Um, but anyway, so it's his home race, so I think that he has a home race advantage, right? But that I think that's probably why the betting line seeing a little bit more favorable, like favorable gains again for Oscar as compared to Lando. And also again, they're in the front row, right? P1 and P2 going into tonight race. So um anything can happen. But on top of this,
Okay.
it's a white condition race in Australia this weekend. If you check the weather, it's 100% rain percentage right now. I don't know what's gonna happen our evening tonight, whether it's gonna be raining, but at least it will be wet condition. Whenever that happens, it typically means anything can happen, right? Um, so I would say again, even with that consideration, as if we compare Lando and Oscar, I still think Oscar should be. I'm just a little bit surprised. It's a little bit low, which I think in my eyes is higher value.
Got it. Sure. So and let me kind of reset. So for the Australian Grand Prix, we currently, I guess the initial numbers I looked at before qualifying, I think was completed. Lando was a favorite,
Hmm.
Lando Norris at plus 170 to Charles Leclerc plus 400 or 4-1 odds. Max Verstappen 425, Lewis Hamilton 650, and Oscar Piastri to 675. Then a long row of outsiders, I guess. I might have been missing a number on George Russell at the point. But when we look now, Lando Norris still the favorite. Max Verstappen now second most likely to win the race according to betting odds,
Hmm.
followed by Piastri, who you mentioned is P2. Um, so is that kind of something we're going to see throughout the season, you think, where Max Verstappen, because he's such a good in-race driver, that he's going to be, I guess, that he's going to be respected more than other racers that are starting ahead of him. Because to me, if we have a P1 and a P2, and Max Verstappen is not one of those, it seems like there's potentially some value on going against Verstappen because there's clearly a lot of belief in him without, I guess, the great starting position.
Yeah, I would say Max definitely has a lot of value. In my opinion, has more value in compared to Lando. The reason being, again, it's a white race, right? It's gonna be rainy, and the Max, if we recall, if some of the fans on the podcast recall last year, 2024 Brazil race, against all odds, like so many restarts, so many red flags, and it's raining and Max still managed to win the race. And I think his starting position was very in the behind of the pack.
Okay.
So all that says he has his ability to manage in the wet conditions is just is uncomparable, right? I think the other person on the track is probably Lewis Hamilton, who's also super excellent in the wet conditions. So that being said, I think yeah, Max, I still think Max has a higher value than Lando. I know Lando is number one, everyone favoring Lando, but I do think Oscar Piastri and Max both have a higher value than Lando.
Sure. So there is a difference between who you expect to win and who is, I think, worth potentially investing in because
Yeah.
most of the time, in my humble opinion, as anyone who listens to the Betting the Pitch podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or on YouTube at the real underscore Drew Warner, you'll hear that most of my strategy is behind trying to find undervalued either soccer
Mm,
teams or basketball teams or baseball teams is usually where I focus. But I think the same type of theory is certainly in play with racing as well and other sports. It's generally looking, and I think the way to be successful in investing specifically, I mean, we know from the stock market, you buy low, you sell high is usually the way to do it. I think you can kind of do that same sort of thing here, and it sounds like what you're advocating. So I would like to get a little bit more information on Lando because he's clearly the favorite to
okay.
win the full season. He's the favorite to win Australia. But it seems like besides having a teammate that might be on a similar level in terms of the car, plus there's plenty of challengers out there. Of course, there is if you're expected to be first. Um, have you seen that the racing community is just always expecting Lando to win? Because to me, that's a big kind of change from when I would look up and Max Verstappen would be a huge favorite every week.
Yeah. Well, I would agree with the betting line and I think the racing community as well because everybody just going into the season based on the understanding from the testing in Barcelona in February, McLaren is strong and Lando is a more experienced driver in that car, right? So I think Lando again is favor. Um, I will say though, we're only beginning in the season, right? Like throughout the season, many things could happen, especially depending on the cars bringing their upgrades across the season. So, I'm a little bit disappointed in Ferrari how they did their qualification last night. But again, it's a long season. They could bring upgrades. Same for Max Verstappen in Red Bull, right? I think his car wasn't probably performing at the expectation that he has, in which he has the highest standard on the grid probably. Um, but again, it's a long season. They may bring upgrades along the way, but I'm trying to answer your question, which is,
I mean, hey, if you're using the handle Roscoe Poop Scooper and you want to bring this to Ferrari and Lewis Hamilton, that's totally cool. This is going to be a Lewis Hamilton podcast. But I do think that that does bring up because really the question was surrounding Lando and kind of what his limitations may be. But maybe I should ask you about Ferrari because it seemed like you wanted to talk about that. Do you want to continue on Lando or do you want me to ask you what's been burning inside me about Charles Leclerc?
yeah, we can pivot to Charles Leclerc because I think
Okay.
there's a lot to be talked about him. Yeah.
Yeah, so neither Charles Leclerc nor Lewis Hamilton have looked very good to the betting market as their odds have surged since qualification. Looks like Charles Leclerc is up to 14 to 1 from just 4 to 1 odds, was the second most likely to win the race, now is down much further than that. And I don't know if that's a
Yeah.
result of others in the marketplace agreeing with you that Ferrari have not invested the way they should have in this, I guess, prepare early part of the season or what you're necessarily seeing there. But I do think there's some, I think it'd be good to discuss Ferrari because they are second most likely to win according to the Constructors' Championship odds.
Yeah, I think we're looking at I think you are asking basically between the second driver for this entire season, right? Whether that should be Max or whether that should be Charles Leclerc.
Hmm.
Especially Ferrari is probably the second best car on the grid right now. Um, I I think it's a again it's a hard call because Max is just such a has such a talent on the grid and no one can deny, right? But Charles Leclerc, with a Ferrari over the past few seasons has been performing pretty solid.
Okay.
And I think with the upgrades along the year, he still has a pretty higher chance to be potentially. I going even after the testing, I was thinking Charles Leclerc could have a chance to, very high chance to be F1 winner this year. So I think maybe because of qualification last night, his probability kind of dropped. But I again, we're only beginning of the season. I think he still have a high potential.
Okay. Then that brings me to the Max Verstappen question. It seems like he's getting bet for this Australian Grand Prix. It seems like he's in the running for the Drivers' Championship, second most likely to win according to the plus 275 odds he's given, implied probability of near 27%. Yet Red Bull are third in the Constructors' Championship winner. Is that because of his teammate, or is that because of the Red Bull car not really stacking up to McLaren and Ferrari that they have for times two drivers?
I love that question because I've been one I guess one of the reason I love F1 is the engineering aspect of it. And Hamilton is my favorite driver, and my favorite engineer is probably Adrian Newey, who had been behind Red Bull for the last decade, and he actually left mid-year last year.
Okay.
There's a lot of drama went on in Red Bull last season. Power dynamic and everything. All the rumor has on the street. But anyway, Adrian Newey left the Red Bull last year, which I think is probably why the car hasn't been as stable as they had been, the past 4 or 5 years when Max Verstappen had been winning.
Okay.
Um, so I think that's one aspect. Liam Lawson is a new driver. He did pretty well when he replaced Daniel Ricciardo last year, which is very sad. Everybody loves Daniel Ricciardo, I'm sure, if you watch Drive to Survive. But he did show pretty good result last year. But again, I think last night how he handled the whole Australia like a qualification, it just didn't really speak his sort of worth of the Red Bull seat as much yet, which is why I think Red Bull is a little bit lower. Again, I think they've been talking about they are planning to bring tons of upgrades over the season, but I have doubt over that, just given the such of engineering mastermind had left the racing team. And
Okay.
I think they had a huge hole to fill there.
All right, so let me ask you this then, because I wasn't really aware of, are you only able to adjust the car significantly at certain points in the season, or are there, because you're mentioning, obviously there's a rule change for 2026, which is I think going to
Yeah.
change the cars completely. What is the normal, I guess, setup or for a vehicle? You essentially enter a season with a car, and then you can make some modifications, minor ones. Uh, Throughout the season, or there are certain limitations? That's an area I don't know much about.
Yeah. I think going into the season, you have sort of a level of specs, right, on your car, whether it's front wing or set pods. There's only, yeah, like you said, minimum change you can introduce along the way, which you bring it every probably. I actually don't know how many upgrades you can bring every season, but people introduce upgrades along the season. That's based mostly because you also have a budget every year, right? Each team has a budget. You can invest for the future development, and also you can invest in your current season car development, use it for testing, use it for um, development in your factory, or just research R&D, right? So that being said, yes, you can bring like upgrades and but I think again, being this is being last year of the um old regulation. I'm again like that's kind of the beginning of the podcast that I was mentioning. I'm interested how much to see how much like drastic upgrades they're gonna bring this season versus like how much they're gonna focus on next season development, right? So I think Red Bull they they probably gonna more be focusing on next year as well because um but I think they still have a solid chance this year, but I just don't think it's as big of a chance as McLaren or Ferrari.
Got it. And the market agrees with that. So I don't think that's too far-fetched for that type of situation. But it sounds like there's still a lot of belief in the driver that is Max Verstappen, and we'll
Yeah.
see if he can kind of get over that hump, defeat his limitations in the engineering room, and whatever, I guess, forced his lead engineer out. So as we kind of come to the later portions of this podcast, we've covered the Drivers' Championship winner, got some ideas and kind of where you're looking there, plus the Constructors' Championship, comparing the teams and how they're going to compete. We've talked a little bit about the Australian Grand Prix, which is coming up in just a few short hours. You mentioned wet conditions, so I'd like to hear a little bit more about that before we get to potentially some picks with maybe an idea of kind of who you're looking at for this weekend. Can you give me an idea? So, wet conditions, that tells me that there's potentially, like you said, a lot more crashes or potentially other issues that could come with that with precipitation, as we've seen as two Texas residents. Anytime there's any sort of precipitation, there's almost like a car on fire every direction. And don't even mention snow in Atlanta, because there always is a car fire when that occurs. What are you expecting in terms of, I guess, the precipitation? And I'm not asking you to be a weather meteorologist or anything in a faraway land, but I am curious how you expect that to impact the race. Does that mean drivers need to take less chances and therefore it's a slower race? Or are there some wild cards who are still going to drive like there's no precipitation falling, and therefore the more skilled drivers kind of emerge in that type of scenario?
Yeah. Um, let's talk about the white race and then let's talk about Australia track specifically. White race, I think white race, like you mentioned, I think always my when I hear it's a white race, I just my initial reaction is looking at the experienced drivers. Is exactly what you said. And if I look at just Hamilton, like I mentioned, he's been really good at in the white race. Um, don't ask me where I got this random fun fact, but I think I read somewhere he's been um over 30% of his win in the last 15 years, 17 years of his F1 career is um in the white race.
Okay, so
And
Lewis Hamilton enjoys precipitation, is what you're telling me.
yeah,
Whether or not he's cleaning up after Roscoe. Okay. And so
yes.
what that then kind of twists for me a little bit is the talk that we had about Oscar Piastri earlier, who, yes, is in his home race, clearly as Australian of some sort. And what you told me is he's a pretty young driver, with clearly a lot of, I think, belief in him and his future career. But we are potentially picking a race tonight, and you mentioned a young driver, and this might not be the race for him because, as you mentioned, wet races and conditions of that nature generally favor the more experienced veteran drivers. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I wouldn't say he's young driver.
Okay.
He's again being in the F1 league for 3 years, so he's been getting enough experience. I we're looking at the grade 20 drivers, six of them being the first time in the F1 starting on the F1 track, you know. So I think as compared to the other six rookies, he's definitely more experienced. Um and and yeah, I think that being said, I still think he has a pretty solid chance. And again, I'm looking at the sort of the betting line for him. I still think there's a lot of value there.
Okay. Well, that might be foreshadowing for the picks portion of our show. We will get there in just one second. I want to make sure that if you are here and are enjoying the F1, please, discussion, because certainly we haven't had anything on this channel before. Please leave a 5-star review, like the podcast on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify, and leave us a comment, especially if you'd like to, I don't know, discuss your, I guess, your other F1 driver fanhoods. Maybe you have a Twitter handle burner account that apparently now has become a very important one on this podcast channel, like potentially Angel. But I think at this point, other than that, I think we're probably going to try to set something going. If this is interesting to you, please let us know on any of the social media channels at Roscoe Poop Scooper, also at the real underscore G Warner across all social media platforms. If you want more of this, if this isn't useful to you, I don't know if I really care about that, but tell us if you like it. And of course, give us some ideas if you want us to be a little bit better. I promise not to be so scatterbrained, as we'll probably be more focused on the next race. But it is that time of the show. We usually give out some intuition or some leans on potentially where to go if you were making an investment on either the full season F1 Drivers' Championship, the F1 Constructors' Championship, or on this Australian Grand Prix. So, at Roscoe Poops Cooper, what would you like to do, Angel, for your pick on this episode?
So I'm looking at the betting line right now. Lando Norris is at what? I guess 150,
Plus
right?
150. Yes. Yep.
Yeah, plus 150. And I don't like the return as much, to be honest. And especially as compared to Oscar Piastri, which is plus 325, correct? And then if I look at the Max Verstappen plus 240, I guess it's better than Lando Norris.
Yep.
Like I mentioned, it's a wet race, it's anyone's race. Meaning like anyone could have a shots, especially if you are in top 10 in the or if you are experienced driver, like we mentioned, right? Um, so my top pick is probably again Oscar Piastri. I would put um I don't know, like maybe $50 on him, like being like just not as experienced gambler as I would say, but
It's all right. What
um
you're doing today, Roscoe's Poop Scooper, you are helping those of us that have a little bit of experience with putting our money on the line. Most, I think, in
yep.
the world have 401ks. Some go a little bit differently and try to do it themselves in a more maverick fashion. So you don't need to tell people how much to put out there, but it sounds like
Okay.
you're looking and you like the plus 240 odds on Max Verstappen for this week's Australian Grand Prix. Am I quoting you correctly?
No, I like the plus 225 for Oscar Piastri.
Oh, excuse me. I'm so sorry that I jumped past.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry.
Okay. No, no. That was probably me in trying to formulate my opinion. So, okay, there we go. And now what we'll do, if you don't mind hanging tightly, I will make the 1 minute video that I post on Apple Podcast, or excuse me, I post on YouTube and on Instagram at the real underscore G Warner, and I will list your pick alongside mine. And this is how if you're rather consume this episode in just a short burst of 1 minute versus the 40 or so we're going to go on today's podcast, certainly understandable. I know with attention spans out there, it's very hard to sit down for that long or have an entire grocery trip or run or something like that just listening to Roscoe's Poop Scooper and I. But thank you, of course, for the support, and let's get into it. So let's get three, two, and one. Hey, this is real underscore G Warner on Instagram, Patreon, Twitter, and on YouTube. This is our first F1 episode featuring Roscoe's Poop Scooper. She just gave out her pick for the Australian Grand Prix. She's going to go with the home race, the young phenom, Oscar Piastri, who's actually been bet down quite a bit by the marketplace as well. She's taking the plus 325 odds on Oscar Piastri to win the Australian Grand Prix. Well, if you listen to the full episode on Betting the Pitch Podcast Network, found on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify under Betting the Pitch, or at the real underscore G Warner on YouTube, you will also have heard that there's a lot of belief in Max Verstappen as a driver. So I'll take the plus 240 on Max Verstappen, grab Oscar Piastri's plus 325 from at Roscoe's Poop Scooper, and we'll be back with you in the future on a future F1 episode. And that's it for this episode. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for coming along at Roscoe's Poop Scooper. What a handle. I can't believe I've said it so many times in actual an ability
I
not to
love it.
crack up. Maybe I'm a professional now. Who knows? But Angel, thanks for coming on. You've been an angel, and I look forward to doing this again very, very soon.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Of course. Okay. And we'll be, of course, many other episodes coming out on the Betting Pitch Podcast Network. We have a huge week coming out with the March Madness coming up, bracket breakdowns, all those sort of things. If you're interested in trying to get some specific exclusive